Thank you very much, Luciana, for that lovely introduction. And thank you, everyone, for coming to listen to me today. It's wonderful to be back at UBC. It's such a pleasure to be at home. Before I carry on, I would like to acknowledge that we sit on the unceded territory of the Musqueam people. So with that, I will begin my presentation and just say that this research, which we called We Feel Fine, and those of you who do information visualization might realize that that title was inspired by an information visualization that gathers social media tweets and analyzes it. We Feel Fine, big data observations of citizen sentiment about state institutions and social inclusion. And what motivated me to do this research was that on December 17th, as you may recall, 2010, a Tunisian fruit vendor named Mohamed Bouazizi took a can of gasoline and set himself on fire in front of the local governor's office. Bouazizi's actions resulted from having his fruit cart confiscated by local police and his frustration at not obtaining an audience with the local governor. His death is said to have sparked what we now know as the Arab Spring. So, obviously this was a terrible event, and it's terrible to think of someone who feels so excluded from governance, from his society, that he would do such a thing to himself, and then, of course, all the events that followed. So I was curious, how we experience governance, and maybe each of you can reflect on governance in your own lives, how institutions make such a difference. We've just had an election. How does governance change our lives? I guess we'll find out in the coming weeks and months how the new government will change the lives of Canadians. But we know that it does, and it can affect our lives in very profound ways. And so I wanted to study that and see how state institutions and how we feel about them in particular and how we experience them relate to social inclusion and social protest in particular. So even though the events of the Arab Spring gave rise to the questions of what causes citizens to protest against their governments, we weren't looking specifically at the Arab Spring. We decided that we would look at the 2014 protests around the FIFA World Cup in Brazil. And so we decided that we would use, because the bank was having this competition on using big data for this kind of social science research, we would use big data approaches. And we wanted to really look at specifically the relationship among these factors of trust in government, trust in state institutions, and citizens' collective behavior, in this case, social protest. And specifically with regard to our case, we wanted to ask, how did Brazilians feel about their state institutions at the time of the 2014 World Cup protests? You might remember those protests. How these feelings connected to their sentiments about Brazilian federal and state government services and politicians, and how such sentiment translated into collective behaviors. So that was really the motivation and then the scope of the project. Now, I had this kind of brainstorm, and I thought, well, let's pull together a team of great people. So I reached out to my colleagues here at UBC. Who else would I reach out to? And I had been the director of the Media and Graphics Interdisciplinary Center before I went on leave to the World Bank, and so I reached out to the associate director of MAGIC, Dr. Brian Fisher, who's also at Simon Fraser University, and one of his talented doctoral students who's a visual data scientist, Nadia Calderon. So I brought Brian and Nadia into the team. Jeff Hemsley at Syracuse University, who some of you may know, who is working in the area of social media, and his graduate student, Billy Seskovich. And also Richard Marciano, who has collaborated with the Inter Pares program in the past, who's the director of the University of Maryland's Digital Curation Innovation Center, and his lab assistant, Greg Jansen. And we were supported by a talented group of World Bank staff as well, who commented and gave guidance on various stages of the project. Rafika Shauli, who is herself a Tunisian, and you'll recall that the events of the Arab Spring began in Tunisia. Stephen Davenport, who does digital media and citizen engagement. Asmin Khan, Tiago Pajedo, I don't know if some of you may know Tiago, a Brazilian, who does work around social accountability and citizen engagement. Robert Beschel, Denisa Popescu, Ellen Bergman, and Robert Baker. And I'd also like to give special mention to one of the students from the Masters of Archival Studies program, a graduate now of the program, Lara Mancuso, who also assisted us in the research. And I'll talk more about Lara's contribution further on. So we had a fantastic team of people. Now you may be wondering how I, as someone who is a member of the faculty at SLAIS and who teaches in the Master of Archival Studies program, whose background is in archival science, got involved in this research. But it's a natural progression because my research is really at the intersection of transparency and information management. And it has been for many years, right, since I did my doctoral thesis on the Jamaican Banking Crisis and how records and information contributed to this financial systemic risk in that crisis. And then my defining research question is really how can we make information more transparent? And transparency has to do with visibility and usable in support of broad public goods such as systemic financial risk management, public accountability, and human rights protection. So those are the issues that I've been working on as a researcher at the bank, and this is one of the projects I've been working on. So we made 4 main contributions in our research, and I'll just go back to this slide. We actually developed and built a visual analytics tool to support this research. So that was one of the contributions, and that work was primarily done by Nadia Calderon. We developed our own methodology of analysis and then combined that with the various tools that we developed. And we connected that to analysis of various explanatory hypotheses about trust in government and social protest from political science literature on the one hand and largely social psychology literature on the other. So it was a mashup of different theoretical perspectives. And we drew from this analysis to draw conclusions specifically about the 2014 World Cup protests, but also to try and make some inferences and that could possibly lead to broader generalizations about the dynamics between trust in government and social protest. And then we used our study to learn also about big data analytics in general and visual analytics in particular as a tool for this kind of study that was involved in unpicking complex theoretical and methodological relationships, such as those surrounding things like citizen trust and social protest, which are not constructs that are necessarily easy to just extract from big data. And then we looked at the future directions of the research, and we've been involved recently in trying to mainstream what we've created into the operations of the bank and change development policy and approaches to development in the course of doing that. So let me talk a little bit about the context of the project. Of course, some of you in the room know a lot about Brazil. But let me just, for those of you who are less familiar, say that you would know it's a South American country. It's the largest country in South America. Of about 8.5 million kilometers squared. According to the World Bank, the country has experienced economic and social progress from 2003 to 2013 after a long period of governance by what would we call a very authoritarian regime, during which time the income of the bottom 40% of the population grew by 6.1% in real terms. So real progress had been made in Brazil. And but Growth was slowing in 2014, the period in which we looked at the tweets that we gathered for this study. And inflation had started to creep up to 6.4%. And of course, in the news more recently is emerging markets generally, but some of the problems that Brazil has been having recently. So in spite of the achievements over the 2003-2014 period, Brazil, over the last decade, has made, inequality remains relatively high, and the country's experiencing greater challenges more recently. We also looked at the information landscape, and why we thought big data was a really interesting approach in Brazil is because Brazil is one of the largest users of social media. It's a very social media savvy country. And so we thought that we would actually be able to learn things because of the way that Brazil uses social media that you might not be able to learn in, for example, South Sudan. So each country has its own information landscape that makes it less or more appropriate, and different channels of communication less or more appropriate to analyze. So as of 2013, roughly 78 to 79% of Brazilians were internet users. And in looking at Twitter in particular, I should just say that the age distribution of Brazilian internet users roughly the distribution is roughly towards the younger age. 17% are under 15, 22.4% between 15 and 24, 23.2% between 23 and 24. So you get the picture, and it reduces from there. Brazil's the world's second biggest user of Twitter. So there's 41.2 million tweeters, or there were at the time of the 2014 FIFA World Cup. And we don't have information, unfortunately, about the geographic distribution of Twitter users in Brazil, but it is reported by one source that it's the social media usage is fairly evenly distributed, even to the remotest and poorest areas of Brazil. So often the assumption is made that social media usage is higher amongst urban, wealthier members of the population, but that does not appear necessarily to be the case, although that source of information needs to be validated. So there's a lot more research to be done on the information landscape. But this just gives you a sense that we're not dealing with, the population as a whole. There was arguments, back when big data research began, no need for sampling anymore. N equals all. But we now have a much more sophisticated approach to big data research. We understand that, yes, we're not dealing with, the entire population. There's a need to understand, what is the population that you're actually looking at, and how may there be inequalities embedded in the population that you actually end up analyzing with any kind of big data research. So a little bit of background then on the World Cup itself. So the FIFA World Cup, if you're not World Cup fans, was the largest sporting event of its kind organized in Brazil up to that date. There were 12 venues that we've marked on this map here in 12 cities. They were selected for the tournament, and the venues covered all the main regions in Brazil. So during the World Cup, Brazilian cities were also home to participating teams at 32 base camps, as well as staging official fan fests where supporters could view the games. So in addition to being the largest event of its kind ever hosted by Brazil, it was also the most expensive. Although some organizers originally estimated costs of US $1.1 billion to host the event, some forecasts on the eve of the tournament estimated that the cost to the Brazilian government was actually closer to US $14 billion. This made the Brazilian Cup the most expensive cup, not just for event for Brazil, but the most expensive World Cup to date. So that was a big hit. During and in the immediate aftermath of the 2014 World Cup, there were public protests in several Brazilian cities, and according to reports, the 2014 protests were much smaller than protests that had taken place the previous year during the 2014 Confederations Cup leading up to the to the cup when millions, literally millions of Brazilians took to the street to reportedly protest about the amount of public money to be spent on the World Cup. So those were called the vinegar riots. Now, during the 2014 World Cup, a number of reports tried to explain why were the people protesting. And you may recall, for those of you who followed this, that one of the major reasons given was that the cost of public transportation had increased. So it was around transport and buses. So we'll come back to that. So that was the reason, and we wanted to look at, well, was that really the reason? Was that really what people felt? What did they actually think? So because we weren't just looking at the Brazilian 2014 protests in and of themselves, just to learn what we wanted to learn about the protests, we also wanted to learn from the protests about trust in government and social protest in general. As I mentioned, we went into the literature on, from political science on trust in government, and also the literature on social psychology on social protests. We had to kind of do that mashup because in political science there's some literature on social movements, but there wasn't much on social protest and the reasons for social protest. So we found that really to try and generate the hypotheses and to really explore our area of concern, we needed to draw from these two broad areas. So I do want to just spend a moment. I've listed some definitions of trust and what it means, because trust is a bit of a slippery concept. And for those of you at the Inter Pares meeting, I mentioned we were talking about trust in relation to the Participedia project and how we measure trust. It's not been easy to measure. It's not even been easy to define. As you can see, these are just 3 of the definitions. But why does it matter? Well, first of all, it matters because many observers have noticed that political trust in government is actually on the decline. And Mark mentioned that when he came to speak to us this afternoon. And particularly in OECD countries, trust in government matters. This slip in trust in government matters because trust in government, as some say, is the basis of legitimacy. So when governments form, and it gives them the right to make decisions about what policies will be pursued, and for citizens to accept that they have that right and to accept the policies that they pursue. So legitimacy is very important, and trust is an important aspect of that, according to some scholars. And there are lots of other reasons, but I won't, for reasons of time, go into it. But I'll just say that, scholars in the area of political science and governance are very concerned about these dropping levels of trust. But it's important to understand what do we mean actually by trust, and then how do we actually measure if it's dropping or it's increasing. And one scholar on the subject has noted that the concept is vague, slippery, subjective, mutual, multidimensional, multidisciplinary, and complex. Sounds like the definition of records for those of you who are MAS students. So I have some definitions here, just briefly. World Bank defines political trust as an assessment by citizens of a government's entitlement to enforce its decisions, laws, and regulations, as well as the probability that it will deliver on its obligations. The UN, public trust is rooted in citizens' perceptions of the legitimacy of government action, for example, in the ability of officials to manage public resources effectively, and more generally to act in the public interest. Edwards says that in the public sector context of engaging with citizens, trust is inferred to follow from interpersonal and interorganizational behaviors where the expectations of each party are clear and confidence exists that what is committed to will be delivered. One that's not here on the slide, Newton Norris say political trust is a central indicator of the public's underlying feeling about its polity. So just to give you a flavor. Various definitions and emphases. Now, one researcher, Blind, subdivides political trust into a macro level or organizational and a micro level or individual trust. And we're just talking about political trust here, not social trust. That's a whole other area. Based on the object to which trust or mistrust is directed. Macro level or organizational trust refers to an issue-oriented perspective whereby citizens become trustful or distrustful of government because they are satisfied or dissatisfied with policy alternatives. In terms of organizations, it can refer to different jurisdictional levels of government, from national to local, to government in general, or in terms of a specific agency, and to various arms of government such as the judiciary and police, parliament, political parties, and the public service. Blind then further subdivides organizational trust into diffuse or system-based trust and institution-based trust. Diffuse political trust refers to citizens' evaluation of the performance of the overall political system and the regime. Specific political trust, on the other hand, is directed towards certain political institutions, such as the Congress or local police force. The second category of political trust is the micro-level or individual level of trust, explained by Blind as happening when it's directed towards individual political leaders. Individual political trust involves a person-oriented perspective whereby citizens become trustful or distrustful of government because of their approval or disapproval of certain political leaders. So there is given that kind of broad frame, there's a wide variety of explanations for declining trust have been put forward in the literature. Edwards talks about declining political trust as very significant decree by country and cultural context, and there remains uncertainty about the relative strength of these causes and the importance of different factors in different contexts and how they might interrelate, and whether these relationships are causal or merely correlative. Edwards groups the factors into those that are external to government, factors over which government wouldn't have any control, and those that are internal to government, policy decisions over which they would have some control, and provides the following examples of external events that have reduced public trust. The global financial crisis is a perfect example of that, the Malaysian air tragedies, the Ebola epidemic. The election of a new government, on the other hand, can increase public trust. Following the 2014 election in India, trust rose by 30 percentage points. So we'll have to watch the indices for Canada. These include, and socio-political factors may affect public trust as well. These include trends such as declines in deference to authority and in social capital. Globalization and related technological, political, and economic changes can alter state-society relationships and also affect trust, and so on. A number of researchers emphasize economic factors as contributing to a decline in public trust. Mansbridge and Newton and Norris associate periods of poor economic performance and citizens' perception that the government is incapable of dealing with current fiscal and financial challenges with lower levels of trust. In contrast to the economic arguments for declining trust, some of the literature concerned with trust in government places emphasis on socio-political causes and makes a distinction between factors that relate to a government's performance, actually what it does, and on the other hand, how it does it, whether it does it in a transparent and inclusive manner. So I would say that trust in government and its relationship with social protest has not received much recent attention in the political science literature. So when I look back at the literature, there was social movement literature, a lot of it based in kind of the, social movements in the 1960s, for example, and the U.S. context. So I found a bit of a lacunae in the literature on social protest and mechanisms for social protest, and particularly it's linked back to trust. And so it was an area that did invite greater research. The study of social protest, however, has really emerged more from the literature on social psychology and sociology. So that's where I started to look for more on this aspect of what we were looking at. But nevertheless, clear definitions of social protest are hard to find even in this literature. So I relied on a definition of social movements and slightly tweaked it for social protest and defined it as collectivities that give voice to their grievances and concerns about rights, welfare, and well-being of themselves and others by engaging in various types of collective action, such as protesting in the streets, that dramatize those grievances and concerns and demand that something be done about them. And I differentiated social protest from social movements by the absence of continuity over time. In other words, social protest is episodic. Social protest also includes a variety of repertoires of contention. These repertoires can range from marches, demonstrations, and pamphleteering to riots and looting. In addition, new repertoires have emerged, such as occupying, hacktivism, and other digital forms of protest, such as blogging and tweeting. So, just as with political trust, various arguments have been advanced regarding why people protest. Classical social protest theories argue that people participate in protest to express their grievances, stemming from deprivation, frustration, or perceived injustice, though this view has been challenged by empirical evidence that not all aggrieved people protest. But prominent amongst the grievance theories has been the theory of relative deprivation. And this is the feelings of relative deprivation resulting from comparison of the protester's situation with a standard, be it from their past or someone else's situation, or a cognitive standard such as equity or justice. Foster and Matheson showed that people who experience both personal deprivation and group deprivation are the most strongly motivated to take to the streets, and Van Zomeren et al. Conclude that the cognitive component of relative deprivation, as reflected in the observation that one receives less than the standard of comparison, has less influence on the action participation than the affective components, such as expressed feelings of dissatisfaction, indignation, and discontent. Suddenly imposed grievances refer to an unexpected threat to people's rights or circumstances. Now, there's a range of other theories on this, but I won't go into those given time. But these were among the hypotheses we extracted for our analysis. And what I'll do in this bit of an eye test here is just relay to you how we then took that literature and we used it, and how we used it in our big data research. So what we did is we started off by operationalizing trust, because we were really looking at measuring trust. And we said, well, how are we going to measure it? So we decided that we would operationalize the measure of trust as citizen sentiment, how they feel about their state institutions. And so the sentiment analysis that we used in this project was key, because it was really how we decided we would measure trust. And we then had to make a choice about how we instrumented that measure. So the instrument that we chose was a particular sentiment analysis tool called SentiStrength. And I'll come back to that. I just want to walk you through the entire methodology first. Then we did an initial big picture harvest of Twitter data. So we harvested about 11 million tweets from the relating to Brazil. We then did visual iterative exploratory analysis of those tweets to arrive at our construct, how we would construct the search terms that we would use to go back and look for our particular areas of concern, information about our areas of concern, which were state institutions and government. We then used those search terms to harvest historical Twitter data. And we harvested a much smaller, in our second harvest, this two-phased approach, smaller number of tweets, but they were targeted to our particular areas of research interest. And then we did sentiment classification of the tweets using our instrument, SentiStrength. And then we did, because we had built a visual analytics tool, we did iterative visual exploration of the tweets using two approaches. One was pair-analysis, which is a methodology developed by Richard Hernandez and Brian Fisher, who is a collaborator on this project. So we have the expert in the room here. And analysis of competing hypotheses, which I'll talk a bit more about later. So that's an overview of the methodology that we use to do our work. So let me talk about the sentiment classifier. It's a rule-based classifier, and it has a dictionary of sentiment words. So it's a lexicon-based classifier using this dictionary of sentiment words. This particular one uses booster words and negating words and question words. You can also use emoticons. We integrated a specific Brazilian lexicon called a New Brazil, and this was recommended to us by Peter Wall, visiting scholar Junia Anaclita. Some of you may know Junia because she participated in the human-computer interaction research group. And so then we also then did evaluation of those words and their sentiment using native Portuguese speakers to tell us whether or not the classification of the words was accurate or not. And Lara was one of the researchers who did that work. So she went through the words and our testing of those words and said, yes, this is the right valence for those words or not. So how it worked is that you had a valence of either positive or negative, and then you had a magnitude of sentiment, which ranged from either 0, which is neutral, to positive sentiment up to the level of positive 4, or negative sentiment to the level of negative 4. And as I said, the classifier would classify individual words, but it would look at those words in the context of the tweet, and there might be some positive words in a tweet and some negative words. And so what it would do is it would decide on the basis of how the weighted average of those words, what that particular tweet should be classified as, and then it would give it a magnitude based on the number of positive words or the number of negative words. Okay, so that's roughly how it worked. So then what we did, as I mentioned, after we decided that we're going to use senti-strength to instrument our operationalize our trust and to instrument the measure of trust, we then had to do this two-phase process where we had to say, well, what are we actually classifying? What are we actually measuring trust in? We were interested in citizens' expression about their feelings about state institutions, so we had to go in and we had to gather tweets that were about state institutions or public services, but people don't tweet, necessarily. If they're complaining about public services, they don't say, I'd like to complain about public services. They use naturalistic language. They describe police in different ways, or education in different ways, or healthcare or water. So how were we going to actually build these constructs that would allow us to find out what citizens felt about state institutions? So we, as I say, harvested 11 million tweets initially, and we did this by putting using geocoded tagging and building a bounded box that was roughly the size of Brazil, harvesting those tweets with the Brazilian language turned on, so that we knew that we harvested tweets that were, in the Brazilian language at least. And the bounding box wasn't exactly the shape of Brazil. It went out into the ocean. There was not a lot of tweeting out there, so we felt relatively confident that we wouldn't get too many false positives. And then we used another visual analytics tool in the lab called Inspire, which does basically clustering of the text. I think I have, maybe, do I have a picture of that? No, I didn't insert that in the slides. But it clusters and creates topic models, basically, of the tweets. So we could see topics emerging. A lot of it had to do with the World Cup, of course, yay, go Brazil, or, bad Germany, and, tweets about movie stars, the usual sorts of things that you get on Twitter. So we were able to filter that out. And from that emerged categories that had to do with Petrobras. About the time that we were doing our tweets, the scandal about all the corruption in Petrobras broke out, but also had to do with health, education, the water crisis and drought, and political opinions, just in general. So we created these categories. And we then decided those were kind of rough categories. We had some emerging words coming out, but we wanted to find, well, what words were those words associated with, so that when we went back in and did our search on the historical tweets, that we would have a broader and more realistic set of search terms to pull out our tweets of interest. And so we did this word co-occurrence analysis to look at how different words were associated with other words in tweets to enrich the categories of tweets that we actually decided we were going to go and search on. And so these are the terms that we actually searched on in the different collections that we created. We created a collection for political opinion, a collection for public services and water, and one for Petrobras. And I'm just wondering if I, very quickly, I don't know if I have, I might be able to very quickly show you the tool actually that we built. So here it is online. And so here's the collections. If I go into, for example, political opinion, you'll see here these are the tweets. The number of tweets here shown in the spike, so you can see periods of spike. If I turn on the events here, you see the World Cup opening, the Brazil-Germany match, the closing, and you can see where spikes occurred in the tweets. You can see also the protest events and where spikes occurred. So we were looking at correlation between the events and the patterns of tweets. This shows positive tweets are the orange, negative tweets the blue, and this is the weighted average of the tweets. But also here you can see the actual absolute values, which is important as well. And then we also created, when we were interested in some patterns, like what was going on, here at this time, and what's not showing on the screen is there's a date showing at the bottom as well. What was going on right here? Why do we have this high density of negative tweets going on? We also were able to then explore, using this bag of words visualization, the actual content, subject content of the tweets. And then, of course, over here on the right-hand side of the dashboard, the visual dashboard, you can drill down into the tweet. So if I were to click on, for example, this word, it's hard to do upside down and backwards. It automatically appears in the search term, and then I'm able to do a search and pull up tweets that are related just to that. I can search by the valence of the tweets, by the dates of the tweets, and then I can see the text of the actual tweet. So that gives you an idea of the tool and its interactive features, which is very important to the methodology we developed, which we ended up calling mixed initiative visual social media analytics, because it involves not just coming out with a sentiment classification and saying that's it, that's our measure of trust, because we know that sentiment classifiers have limitations, which I'll talk about, but the human analyst can interact with the data space to explore hypotheses, generate new hypotheses, and derive insights. And that's the whole idea behind visual analytics, is to do that. Okay. So then going back into this, moving on to the next slide. There we are. So here's this visual sense-making loop. And I'll just say, so about visual analytics, I just wanted to give you a bit more detail about that, because we made a decision right from the beginning that because of what we knew about sentiment classifiers, that find it very difficult to pick up irony or to understand context, that we needed to keep the human in the loop. So the idea of visual analytics is that, and visual analytics, for those of you who are not familiar with it, it's sort of circa 2005, is often defined as the science of analytical reasoning facilitated by interactive visual interfaces. and it's an analytical approach that accounts for the need of a human in the loop in the analytic sense-making process. From a traditional visual analytics perspective, people engage in analytical processes in order to transform information into knowledge and to later test it and share it. As Thomas and Cook, who are one of the founding, wrote one of the founding texts on visual analytics, describe analytical reasoning techniques are the method by which users often obtain deep insights that directly support situation assessment, planning, and decision-making. A usual visual analytic scenario involves a large data set to explore, cognitive tasks that need to be supported to make sense of the data, and interactive visual tools that mediate between the data and the analytical agents. So in this project, the exploration of social media data was to explore the relationship between trust in government and social protest, as I said. So we had a set of exploratory and hypothesis testing tasks that would require a structured way to access large amounts of data and textual data and make that available for analysis. And it was just too large, for a single analyst to read and parse. So we needed visual tools to help us visualize, see, make transparent the data, and allow us to interact with it to derive new insights. Okay, so then once we had the tool developed, we used these two approaches to exploring the data space using the visual analytics tool. And one was pair analysis. And pair analysis, do I have that here? The definition, but basically, Richard, you can probably say the formal definition, but the idea is that you have a domain expert who understands the domain of analysis, a visual analytics tool expert who knows how to drive the visual analytics tool. The two work together in a sort of a collaborative cognition to explore the data space. So the domain expert might say, let's explore this. Looks at the data and says, well, this is very interesting. I think I'd like to look at the data and see if this hypothesis that looking at the data makes me think of, if I can find any evidence for that. And the visual analyst would then navigate the tool to present the data in a new visual form that would stimulate further thinking. So this is the kind of idea, and it comes from pair programming as the original inspiration for it, where you work together in these kind of collaborative teams. So we did some initial exploration, Nadia and I, using this approach to explore the data space. And then we moved on to another approach, which is the analysis of competing hypotheses, which involves a 9-step process. And the idea of analysis of competing hypotheses is that you would look at hypotheses that you derive from the literature, and you're trying to be objective about saying, what evidence do I find against that hypothesis, and what evidence do I find in support of the hypotheses in the data space using the visual tool. So in order to work on this, we would explore the aggregated views of temporal patterns of tweets with the ability to overlay external event flags, as I showed you, explore the sentiment trends using the horizon charts, which were the layers of sentiment that you could see in the visualization. Let me just see if I have it there. There we go. We would obtain an overview of the text content from the text cloud. We would read details of the individual tweets to understand digital opinion patterns, filter the tweets, and sort the tweets in order to do our investigation. So moving on from there very quickly, the analysis of competing hypotheses methodology involved then identifying the possible hypotheses, which we put in just an Excel spreadsheet, and there were about 68 of them. And we then use this matrix or list of hypotheses to analyze the strength, as I mentioned, We refined that in an iterative process of analysis. And, I should just mention that strength was defined in two ways. Diagnosticity, which is the degree to which the evidence could be used to support the relative likelihood of the alternative hypotheses, and representativeness, I should say, the degree to which the evidence is indicative of a wider pattern within the sample. Now, we did this manually and with a single analyst, and this is, obviously a limitation. We had external experts from the bank then look at what we'd found and provide insight and feedback, and we iterated that way. But ideally, looking back, I would like to have another analyst also run through the same process to validate, so a kind of an intercode of reliability. And we also want to use machine learning approaches to actually help us find the evidence to support the representativeness. So we think there's some good opportunities to use interactive machine learning to strengthen the tool in the future. Okay, so that's an overview of the process, but what did we actually find? So turning to what we actually found, it's just so rich what we found. I can't go into all of the details, but basically mostly drawing upon the analysis of competing hypotheses, because that's where we started to really link back out to the literature and be able to make more generalizable assertions. We divided in the literature into two groups: the hypotheses on from political science literature and on trust in government, and the hypothesis on social protest. Now, I should just say that a number of the hypotheses that we did draw from the literature, we couldn't refute or we couldn't prove because we just didn't have the evidence. And these related to things like the particular paths to social protest, whether the tweets actually led to physical protests on the streets, because we didn't have the geocoded data from the historical data that we needed to assert these. But turning to the hypotheses for which we did find support, we found that there was a lot of support for the hypothesis of relative deprivation, the relative deprivation theory that I referred to earlier. So, coupled with notions of public trust that involve citizens' assessment of government's ability to follow through on promises, deliver on policy objectives, and act with integrity. So in social theory, relative deprivation, again, is the notion that individuals or groups lack something that another group has and to which they feel some entitlement. The important emphasis here is that they feel this deprivation in relation to some standard or other group, not in absolute terms, which is one of the other hypotheses that we were looking at. And this put forward the proposition that government performance or policy outcome is more important in Latin America than perhaps the process. Evidence from this collection also indicates that it's not performance or outcomes per se, but performance or outcomes for one group, in our case, Povo Brasileiros, relative to another group or external standard, in this case, spending on the World Cup, for example. Many of the negative tweets in the collection, and a good proportion of the positive tweets, because some were false positives because it couldn't capture irony, express strong sentiment. So we really did find support for the hypotheses that affect is very important. Anger, disgust, discontent, and disgruntlement were strong themes in the tweets. Two public services in particular are the focus of such tweets: education and health. And we suspect, based on information in the content of the tweets, but cannot definitively prove without additional corroborating evidence, that emphasis on these two services in the political opinion collection is a reaction to a speech given by Dilma Rousseff just prior to the start of the World Cup. So she actually shot herself in the foot and, kind of incited her people to social protest. In other words, resources were made available to spend on the World Cup, depriving the Povo Brasileiros, as the tweeters define themselves of investments in education, healthcare, and other public services, and a better standard of living. In the public service delivery collection, the water shortage is mentioned more prominently, and the focus was at the state level, so we find different levels of government, we find different issues are surfacing, and more behavior, the focus was more the behavior of state-level politicians and CISSP, the water authority. It was this sense of relative deprivation that seems most evident during periods exhibiting spikes of heightened sentiment. Not necessarily positive or negative, but just heightened sentiment. This theory also explains the wide variety of issues that surfaced in the tweets, from water to education, health, police, transport, threat of increased taxes and inflation. These all contributed to a sense of relative deprivation. So it wasn't just increases in bus fares. There were a wide range of issues that had been simmering for a long time, coupled with this sense of relative deprivation, which had been introduced and exacerbated by the comparison with the spending on the World Cup. And so this created a negative sentiment around people's growing distance, the sense of themselves as the haves versus the have-nots. And this was also exacerbated or amplified by the perception of corrupt and dishonest politicians who were personally benefiting, or at least not suffering like everyone else, and not delivering on promises to people about spending. So in relation to macro versus micro levels of political trust, we found evidence that tweeters expressed more distrust of the federal government and federal politicians, the micro level of political trust, where they talked about service delivery more so, and institutional mechanisms rather than individual politicians. And even in the political opinion collection, however, there were references to water, education, and health, so a strong assertion about this can't be made. Within the service delivery collection, fewer tweets leveling direct criticism at politicians or political parties were found, so maybe the institutions or the services were more important. But caution about support for or against this hypothesis is advised because of the manner in which the data were collected. So, so these are some of the things that we found, and you know, I guess we'll start to wrap up, because it's the first study that we're aware of where this kind of iterative, mixed initiative, visual social media approach to this topic has been tried. And so just to recap, we started with this large geocoded set of tweets. We used the visual analytics techniques to identify specific terms from our collected tweets that we utilized for a second round of data collection. And in the second round, we purchased historic data and used the sentiment analysis to classify tweets. And then we conducted an iterative mixed initiative social media analytics using pair analysis and analysis of competing hypotheses. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about all the limitations of this research, of which there are many. This is very exploratory. This approach is, you know, we developed it as very novel. We're just trying it out in this area. So there are, of course, a number of limitations. The representativeness of the sample I've already discussed. The performance of the sentiment classifier, which is a problem not just with the sentiment classifier, but with sentiment classifiers in particular, or in general. But so we think here there's some opportunity to use, again, a mixed initiative machine learning approach. So the analyst can say, no, that's all wrong. That shouldn't be a positive tweet, or that shouldn't be a negative tweet, and train the classifier on the fly. So we think we have a solution for that. Missing historical metadata, so the particular historical tweet gathering service that we used, has an agreement with Twitter that it can't provide geocoded data. So we weren't able to go back and look at, you know, well, where were these tweets coming from in the 1% of tweets that actually have geocoded turned on. We're now trying to use a methodology where we extract using data mining techniques, text mining, and natural language processing, and make inferences about the geolocation of the tweets from the content of the tweets as well as from the geocoded data. So we'll see how that turns out. Some of the topical themes may have introduced bias into the collection, and also because we harvested later in 2014 and 2015 some possible historicity because the Petrobras scandal hadn't broken, for example, back during the 2014 World Cup event. So these kinds of things we have to look at how we would deal with that. We weren't able to do network analysis and to look at contagion and spread of tweets and their effect on social protest and how those ideas spread. That whole area has been actually studied. There's a lot more work on that, so we know that's an obvious direction to head with this research, but we wanted to try something different. We can do a lot of improvements to our tool design. We could use more domain expertise because we were doing this with some input from the World Bank staff, but we didn't have, we weren't working directly with, on our research team, political scientists, so we'd like to. We had a cognitive psychologist, but we didn't have a social psychologist, so that would definitely be good. The one that I also wanted to draw attention to, of course, privacy and the ethical issues. So all of this Twitter data is out there in the public realm. And we've talked about a lot about this in the context of the Inter Pares project and no doubt, in your courses. But it's all out there. People tweet. Those are public. But, obviously, they wouldn't, when you tweet, and when the protesters of the 2014 World Cup tweeted, they weren't thinking some pointy-headed researcher was going to come along and harvest up all their tweets and analyze it. And we did find, some tweets that were actually expressing very negative, and if you're inciting people to protest, possibly some extremely negative and possibly reputationally damaging, maybe that would encourage retaliation of the sort that we talked about today earlier. So we're very aware of that. That's why we don't show the names of the tweeters on our tool. We haven't publicized our tools. Very interestingly, people were very excited when we came out with the research and we wanted to tweet about the tool and make it available, but we hadn't sufficiently dealt with those reputational issues to make this public yet. And obviously, for the World Bank's clients, the idea is to use these kinds of studies to look at these issues of social, trust in government and social protest. However, if the tools are then and the capabilities are given to some of the governments that the World Bank deals with are not the most democratic governments. Some of them are, have a less than savory track record in human rights. Will these tools be used? And so I think there's some thinking to do about when mainstreaming this capability into the bank's operations, how we will make the safeguarding, considerations about safeguarding. So, Richard, I'll catch up with you later. So these are issues that we're still trying to work out. So I know I've gone on a little too long. Maybe we have some time for questions. Maybe one or two questions, Luciana? Do we still have time?
I don't know whether the class is booked at 6 o'clock. That's the thing. And some students have to go to class, but maybe one question?
And I'm happy to stay and talk to people after if you have questions about this. In the corridor. Or at dinner. Come for dinner. No questions?
No question? Okay.
Okay.
Well, thank you so much.